Okay. Come on, cat. I'm just now getting started on something. You have to start bothering me right this moment. Alright, now we are moving into the latter portions of Genesis. Genesis 37. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. This is actually going to be about Jacob's sons, primarily Joseph, but also the rest of them. So these are the family records of Jacob. This is the last time we're going to see this phrase in Genesis. This is the last account we're going to be reading, or Toledeth family records that we're going to be reading in Genesis. Once we get done with this, we'll catch up to Moses in his own time, which is what we're going to see in our book of Exodus. So this will be the last part of the story that will help set the stage for the conditions that Moses himself was born into. This is the account. So this is also going to, now I'm not going to get all the way through this account today, but during this time, during this account, we're going to be intermingling with Egypt. We're eventually going to end up having the entire family move down to Egypt for a period of time. And so this is where the Israelite and Egyptian history is going to get mixed up. And then we're going to start talking about the Egyptian record and how that has got us all messed up in our minds today, academically, in terms of chronology and archaeology and things like that. So we're going to be getting into a lot of material. Not all today. I don't know how far I'm going to get today. But this section here, from now and through the Exodus or whatever, is going to be pretty laden with heavy-duty stuff. Joseph, remember, the Genesis itself is a history that is written to lead up to where Moses picks up in his own lifetime. Okay, Moses was not present for any of the events in Genesis. But everything from Exodus until the end of Deuteronomy, he was present for. That section of the scriptures is basically kind of like his own autobiography or his running diary. We're going to find several examples during that time period of God telling Moses to write stuff down as it's happening. So you can almost think of those 4 books as being kind of like Moses' own diary. To whatever degree people in the 15 and 1400s BC had diaries. But not this. This stuff is all before that. And so the story in Genesis ultimately is designed to get us to where Moses' time picks up at the beginning of Exodus. Of course, Exodus itself covers Moses' life from the time of his birth to the time he leads the Israelites out of Exodus, which is a long period of time too. Moses was 80 when he led them out of Egypt, so there's a long period of time even within that that's being covered over very quickly at the beginning of Exodus. But Genesis as a work is all about leading up to that point. So everything that we read in Genesis ultimately is there to lead us to this situation where the Israelites move down to Egypt, and that's where they are when Moses comes along. Anyway, so now we're going to be getting into the story of the circumstances about how that happens. Joseph, a young man of 17. So Joseph was born when Jacob was 91 years old. He was the 11th son, 12th child total. At least 12th child that we know of. Probably 12th child total. There may have been other daughters later on. Dinah is the only one mentioned, and like I said when I read that section of Genesis 34, the only reason why Dinah is mentioned is because what happened to her explains why Simeon and Levi, her older brothers, get passed over in the birth order for the blessing and the inheritance later on. Otherwise, if that hadn't happened, Dinah herself probably wouldn't be mentioned. Her birth and her life, that's the only reason why her name is recorded in the scriptures. So Jacob may have had other daughters too, probably later on. I mentioned earlier how extremely weird Jacob's timeline is and how tight that timeline was for all those sons to be born to those 4 women in such a short period of time. So I don't think there would have been any time for other daughters to be born during that time period, but he could have had other daughters via Leah or his maidservants, because Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, but he still had Leah, Zilpah, and Bilhah. I'm not sure if he was still having sex with Bilhah and Zilpah anymore. Maybe, I don't know. But he still had Leah, so Leah could still have been giving birth to daughters even after we read about the sons. And if that's the case, if that, the word daughters is mentioned in the plural form later on when it talks about Jacob's family going down to Egypt. So he may have had more than one. The only reason why we even know about the one that he did have, the one that we know he had by name, is because her story is important to understand why Simeon and Levi get passed up in the birth order for the blessing and the inheritance. So the names of daughters just weren't all that important to be mentioned. If they didn't have to be mentioned for some specific reason, they weren't mentioned. And that's the case with Dinah, and probably the case with any other daughters that Jacob may have had later on. Anyway, Joseph is now 17, so Jacob is 108. Because Joseph was born when Jacob was 108. All of Joseph's brothers would have been older than him, but not by a whole lot. Okay, I used to think that there would have been a significant age gap potentially between him and, say, Reuben, who was the oldest. No, I don't think so. If Joseph is 17, I don't think Reuben is a whole heck of a lot older than him. Looking at the timeline, there just isn't a lot of time for all these boys to have been born too far apart from each other. So there would be only a few years at most. Reuben would be in his mid, maybe late 20s at most. So, and he's the oldest, and so there isn't a lot of wiggle room in the age order. Actually, Benjamin was born a number of years later, but those first 11, they're pretty close together in time. So even though Joseph is the 11th, the oldest wouldn't have been all that much older than him, and all the others, of course, would have fit in between. Anyway, reading on. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. So Joseph was a tattletale. These are his half-brothers. Well, I mean, all of them would be his half-brothers except Benjamin. Benjamin is the only brother he had that came from the same woman, Rachel, who's dead now, of course. But these would be the sons of the maidservants. And those are, I always have to remember these. Let's see here. No. Gad is, no, let me make sure. I admit, I always get confused by these. The sons of the maidservants, where are they? There we are, right there. Okay, Bilhah, maidservant of Rachel, Dan and Naphtali, and Zilpah, maidservant of Leah, Gad and Asher. So Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Those were the sons of the maidservants. So he is being his father a bad report about Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, who again would only be in their early 20s at this point, so not a whole lot older than him. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. He's playing favorites because he had been born to him in his old age. Now, this is one of those things that's really strange. I said before several times about how incredibly weird Jacob's timeline is. Joseph would have been born when Jacob was 91 years old, but the others wouldn't have been born much earlier than that. I don't know exactly what the Bible considers old age at this point. I mean, he didn't leave his father's house until he was in his 70s. Jacob was already in his 70s when he left his parents' house, and he was still unmarried. To me, that's old. Okay, and if he gets to Laban and works for him for 7 years, then gets married and starts having kids, like, he's 80 years old or thereabouts when he starts having kids. To me, that's old. I'm not sure. I really don't know, and I'll admit this is just strange to me. The Bible, Jacob has a very strange timeline that the Bible doesn't really call a lot of attention to. Unlike, say, with Abraham. I'm sorry, there's a cat right here, and I'm trying to make certain that she doesn't knock over this. Okay, there we go. I just don't want her to knock over. I know she wants to knock over this camera. She wants to do that very badly. I can see it in her eyes. So I have to stay diligent whenever she's around to make sure she doesn't do that. There's a cord here, of course. A cord here that, oh my goodness, that cat would just love to grab onto that cord and yank that thing down. I mean, nothing would pleasure her more than to do that, so I just have to be constantly vigilant when she's out and about. Anyway, like with Abraham, for example, it calls attention to his timeline saying that he was 75 when he left his father's household, and he was 100. He was 86 when Ishmael was born, 100 when Isaac was born. Sarah was 10 years younger than him, and was 90 when she gave birth to Isaac. Like, the Bible calls attention to that, but Jacob has an even weirder timeline. The Bible actually doesn't call any attention to. Now, we know how to put together his timeline because it does give us certain dates. It gives us dates about Joseph, for example. He's 17. Later on, it will say he's 30 when he enters Pharaoh's service. Then we know that Jacob went down into Egypt in the 9th year after Joseph started working for Pharaoh. And then at that time, Jacob gives his age as 130. So we know then that he had Joseph when he was 91. And we know that he worked for Laban for 20 years. We know he worked 7 years for one wife, 7 years for another, and then 6 years after that. So we can kind of put together the basics of the timeline, even though the Bible itself doesn't really call attention to that. And I don't know why Joseph is called out as being born to him in his old age when all of his sons, to me, would have been born in his old age. My guess is that Joseph was Jacob's favorite because he was the first born son of Rachel, the only woman that Jacob ever wanted to marry. The text doesn't say that, though. It says that he was Jacob's favorite because he was born to him in his old age. And I honestly do not know how to reconcile that with him having Jacob at 91 compared to the previous sons who he would have had when he was in his 80s, which to me is pretty old age too. I think behind that you still get the sense that Rachel was the woman he wanted to have a kid with, and he finally got Joseph, the first kid, from that woman when he was an old man. But it's weird. Like, it's very, very strange. And I'll admit it. It's not strange enough to shake my faith. It's just, to me, my view on this is just, I find this very strange. Apparently the person who wrote this, Moses, whatever records he's working from, he didn't consider this strange. He doesn't bring any attention to this, doesn't call it out. He does apparently consider Abraham and Sarah somewhat strange, because he does call attention to them. But apparently he doesn't consider Jacob's timeline to be particularly strange. He doesn't call any attention to it. But I consider it strange. What can I say? So Joseph was Jacob's favorite because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made a richly ornamented robe for him. We don't know exactly what this robe would have looked like or been like, but we have illustrations, we have ancient depictions from Egypt of Asiatics, Midianites, and other people like that moving into Egypt or passing into Egypt, and you can see them drawn with long coats. We would almost consider them dresses today, the way they wrapped around their bodies and went down to about their knees or so. So it probably looks something along those lines. We don't know what this exact coat looked like, but we can find probably some pretty good visual depictions of what those sorts of coats would have looked like in the art the Egyptians left behind. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I have had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream that he had said. And what he had said, excuse me. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brother, so this one he tells to his father too, apparently, his father rebuked him. So even his father had a problem with it, and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His mother had actually died by this point. His birth mother, Rachel, had died. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So let's talk a little bit about this. There are some people, I have heard it presented before at times, that Joseph is one of the few characters in the Bible that the Bible doesn't have anything negative to say about. I don't think that's true. I think Joseph does have negative things about him that the Bible indirectly comments on, or has included in it, that doesn't necessarily point out necessarily or bring attention to his bad characteristics, but I think they're there. I think as a young man, he was his father's favorite. I think he knew he was his father's favorite. I think he lorded that over his older brother. He was the 11th brother. I mean, he wasn't anywhere close to the top of the list. So, but he was his father's favorite. So I think that he lorded that over his brothers and waved it in their face probably pretty constantly as a young man growing up. And I am not the firstborn. I have an older brother, but I also have a younger brother. And I'm telling you, like, there's nothing more irritating than an annoying younger brother. Okay, it's like there is nothing. Many times growing up, I wanted to beat my younger brother up so badly. Just wanted to just pound him into dirt, just over and over, every day. Every day I wanted to beat him up. I mean, that's just how it is. Okay, maybe my older brother thought the same about me. I mean, I'm not. I have one younger brother. I have an older brother who has two younger brothers, of which I am one. Maybe he thought the same about me. I know he thought the same about my younger brother because we agreed on that. Maybe he thought the same about me too. But I know from my experience having a younger brother growing up that there is nothing more irritating than an annoying younger brother. So it's not hard for me to imagine. And again, Joseph wouldn't have been that far behind them. Again, the timeline is such that they would not be that many years older than him. They wouldn't be that much more mature than him. If he's 17 here, they're only going to be in their 20s. Some of them might even still be in their teens. So they're not mature 30-plus-year-old men. I used to think that. I used to think, for example, that Reuben, who is the oldest, the actual oldest, might have been like 30-plus years old. I don't think he is anymore. I think he's probably in his mid-20s here. So he's not too much older than Joseph. I think he may be more mature than the rest, but they're not a group of mature, firmly established men who are their own adult males at this point. They're not. They're young men who are still hot-headed and tempestuous. And they have an annoying younger brother they've lived with all their lives. Clearly their father's favorite. Has always been their father's favorite. And they've grown up probably being very resentful of him. And again, I believe that he has grown up being very annoying. I believe that Joseph would have been a very annoying younger brother to have. I think he was probably very pleased with his position as his father's favorite and was probably very prideful. Now, again, the text doesn't explicitly say this, but I think you can clearly see an indication here that Joseph's attitude was not where it needed to be. God couldn't work through Joseph here at this point in time. That's why he's going to send him into slavery and prison for 13 years. And he's going to not be put into the position where God ultimately wants him to be in until he's 30 years old and has lost some of these bad attitudes. So I think it's inaccurate, even though the Bible itself doesn't directly condemn Joseph for his, it does mention his brothers hated him, but it doesn't directly condemn Joseph for his own negative attitude, which fostered his brother's hatred. But I think you can see it clearly depicted here.